Good evening, and thank you all for being here. Can you hear me all right? Everyone can hear me. I'm Margaret Gibson, Poet Laureate of Connecticut, and with me today are scientists Eric Hammerling and Syma Ebbin, both of whom work in Connecticut. The title of our panel is Science and Poetry, Partners in Understanding Climate Emergency. The question that guided our panel in preparing our panelists in preparing their presentations was this: how can knowledge of climate science amplify the reading and writing of poetry about the natural world? Eric Hammerling has been Connecticut Forest and Park Association's Executive Director since May 2008. A former Executive Director for the Farmington River Watershed Association, he holds an MS in Environmental Science, Range Management from UC Berkeley, and a BA in History from the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. Eric is the lead advocate for CFPA at the state legislature, where he primarily works on forestry, recreation, conservation education, and trail-related policy issues. Syma Ebbin is a faculty member of the University of Connecticut and the research coordinator for Connecticut Sea Grant. Affiliated with the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics and Maritime Studies program, she teaches courses in environmental and marine science and policy at UConn Avery Point campus. Recent collaborative research includes an examination of ocean literacy and integration of the arts and humanities into ocean education efforts. I asked these two scientists to read poems in Waking Up for the Earth, Connecticut Poets in a Time of Global Crisis, and they are here with us today to explore how a knowledge of science can amplify our reading and our writing of poems about the natural world. In this time of climate emergency, for which there is ample scientific data, too many people question or ignore or are numb to climate crisis, its causes and its impacts on forests and oceans, its impact on humans. Collectively, our response is inadequate. We live in a time when we not only have to make changes in how we humans live sustainably on this earth, but we must also transform the misunderstandings we hold about our relationship to the natural or living world. I taught a class once on nature and poetry, and I asked the students to define nature the first day of class, and 90% of them wrote, "That which is not me, that which is not human, that which is separate." So that's the kind that, this was some years back, but that's the hurdle we need to get over. Human beings can be magnificently creative, but we also spoil soil, water, air. We overheat the atmosphere by using fossil fuels. We melt polar ice. The extinctions of other species multiplies. We ourselves endure fires and floods and increasingly more violent storms, and soon famines and migrations will rearrange global politics. The problems we face slowing down global climate change are huge. In a time of injured life, what can poems do? What can words do? Can words effect change? And what kinds of words? More questions. How do we address climate change? What is the language of that address? How do we make injury articulate? What are the consequences of not speaking up, of not recognizing the suffering and increasing peril caused by the way humans live on this earth? What is the language that allows us to re-see ourselves and therefore revise ourselves? Oddly, poetically, we begin to see when we pay attention to others unlike us. This is the basis of metaphor, which at its root means a yoking together of unlike things, and of using language which is specific and concrete, earth-rooted words. With new scientific information comes a need to imagine a new way of speaking. If we listen to the facts and information given to us by scientists, our ways of knowing and speaking begin to change. Here's some examples of poetry and science working together from the anthology, just a few excerpts from Waking Up to the Earth. The poet Mary Guitar writes, quote, "What we know of the world could be balanced on the carapace of this beetle with the pink face stripes." She didn't make up that beetle. She'd done her research, and the facticity of the beetle with his wonky three pink face stripes gives the image of fine strangeness. Edwina Trenton tells a bedtime story to a child sometime in the future, and it begins, "Once there were these beautiful things called trees." The leap of imagination into the future captures loss and begins an elegy of hindsight made poignant by the word once, from Once Upon a Time. David Leff speaks with a hermit thrush and evokes the seasonal confusions that occur with global warming, evoking the loss, that synchronicity of timing, which evolved slowly between a bird and the habitat it needs in the breeding season. He begins to listen to the hermit thrush, and by giving it voice is a way of acknowledging the animacy, the animateness of the natural world, which is not passive or dumb or stupid. It is intelligent and animate, and we can listen to it and learn. Christy Max Williams uses what he knows of the mating of horseshoe crabs, salmon, and sandhill crane, evoking beauty and fact, breaking our heart with the question, "Oh mama, can it last?" In The Trembling, poet John Stanitzy praises Pando, a clonal colony of an individual male quaking aspen, and he finds in this strange being a similarity to humans. He does not separate himself from the aspen. Both aspens and humans tremble. A national shrine, he calls Pando. Grace, past, art. Whether poets write looking at a sunflower in an urban housing project or watching wild turkeys at a backyard bird feeder, whether a poet listens to the recorded voice of a now extinct sparrow or gives voice to a hermit thrush or a yellow birch, we poets will find the language to release in us wonder and gratitude, fear and awe. Only then, like the trees in Lana Orphanides' poem, can poets, quote, show us how to speak to one another, how to save the world, unquote. I asked Eric and Syma to take a poem or a part of a poem and use it to jump off into the scientific knowledge they have of woodlands and waterways, wetlands and oceans. I can't wait to see where they land and what we learn about the interface between science and poetry, scientific fact, and imagination. Thank you for being with us.
Okay, so you know a little bit about social distancing. After the last few years, you're going to also have a little bit of social distancing happening today. The slides that I'm going to be referring to are over there. I'm over here. I will not be offended at all if you orient yourself towards the slides, but I really appreciate you all being here, and thank you, Margaret, for giving us the opportunity to think not just about the policy and the science that we're typically involved in, but also the opportunity to connect that with the natural world, with poetry. And I would say that I am not a poet, but I am fortunate to work with poets, and I'll get back to that in just a moment. So, as Margaret mentioned, my name is Eric Hammerling. I'm the Executive Director of the Connecticut Forest and Park Association. I've been with CFPA since 2008. Connecticut Forest and Park Association is actually the oldest nonprofit conservation organization in Connecticut. It started in 1895, before there were state parks or state forests or a Yale School of Forestry or municipal conservation commissions, and there have been many things that since that time have been part of our mission. But from the very beginning, our mission has been about connecting people to forests, to parks, to the natural world, to ensure that people had better understanding and a sense of stewardship over those natural resources that we hope will be there for us and for future generations to enjoy. When we talk about the work that we do at CFPA, we typically talk about it in 4 categories. And I tend to use a very outdoorsy acronym of ACRE to talk about the advocacy, the conservation, the recreation, and the education work that we do. Here's a few of the things that we've been working on in the advocacy realm, and some recent accomplishments that I'll just mention that we're really proud of is the institution of the Passport to the Parks program. Some of you may be aware that in Connecticut, thanks to this program that started in 2018, we now can all get into any state park for no fee that we have to pay at the gates. It used to be, if you went to a shoreline park like Hammerling on a weekend, you'd have to pay $13 to get in. Today, everyone, if you have a Connecticut license plate, you get into the state parks, and that's a big outcome from the Passport to the Parks program. By the way, it's not talked about enough as a program that is very much about equity and ensuring that there is access to our public lands for all. Also in 2009, the New England National Scenic Trail, it was designated in Connecticut as one of only 11 national scenic trails in the nation. You've all heard of the Appalachian Trail, but perhaps not the New England National Scenic Trail. But you might have heard of the recent, or the local name, the New England Trail, which is the Metacomet Trail, or the Matabesa Trail, or the Minocottuck Trail. That's what the New England Trail has been called for years. And anyway, I'll talk some more about that as we go. In terms of conservation, CFPA is actually a statewide land trust, and we have about 2,000 acres of properties, typically forested and with trails as well, that are stewarded for the public use and enjoyment. One of our efforts today is to try to connect trail corridors and make sure that they aren't lost to development, and that'll be something that we focus on again for future generations. Recreation is all about connecting people to the outdoors, and I would just say as a little footnote here, Connecticut Trails Day, which is held the first weekend of June, is the largest Trails Day celebration that takes place anywhere in the nation. There will be over 200 events happening all around the state. All of them are free. We would encourage people to get out and explore. And if you go to trailsday.org, you can see the listing of the events that have been listed so far. And then, of course, what we're probably the best known for today is maintaining over 825 miles of Blue Blaze hiking trails all around the state, through 96 towns, with an army of amazingly dedicated volunteers who are taking care of these areas, keeping them open for the public to enjoy. Some of you may have a Connecticut walk book that goes back you might have one that goes back to 1936 when they were first published. We'll be coming out with the 21st edition of the Connecticut walk book in the next few months. And then education. We typically talk about all the different ways that we get people outdoors. Here's a school group in Wyndham that we've formed a wonderful relationship with the Wyndham schools and Goodwin Forest. The connections that are happening there are really exciting. But I do want to talk a little bit about the arts, of course, as part of what we discuss here. As part of the work that we've done in the New England National Scenic Trail, since around 2011, we've had an artist in residence program for the New England Trail. It has been discontinued, unfortunately, because that's funded by the National Park Service, and funding has dried up for that program. But for many years, we've had poets like David Leff. We've had visual artists, photographers. We've had musicians, all creating art inspired by the New England National Scenic Trail. And I've got to say that's been a really exciting way to connect more people to the outdoors in innovative ways connected to the arts. But if you went to the New England Trail website, newenglandtrail.org, you can see information on all of the artists in residence who have participated in that program over the last several years. Okay, so getting to what Margaret asked us to get right into. She mentioned John Stanizzi right at the beginning, and the Trembling is the poem that he wrote that really resonated with me. It's about this, let me just read you a few things without my glasses as best I can from across the stage. Okay, and this is some selections from the beginning, the middle, and the end of that poem. Poplars, just like people, are trembling most of the time. The poplars because of the flatness and angle of their petioles to the wind. That flatness causes tremors. The trembling we see in people, who knows? Then in the middle, let's talk about Pando and the clonal colony of quaking aspens that have quaked for 80,000 years, raised past art. And then concluding, poplars, just like people, are trembling, most contingent upon the wind to make them. Let's talk about Pando and the clonal colonies of poplars, natural shrines, sacrificing their leaves to the bare wind. So let's talk about Pando and what is this special natural treasure that we have in our country. By the way, how many of you have heard of Pando before tonight? Okay, so I four people here, and this is, I would say, a very well-read group. So okay, good. A few people might learn something today. So Pando is actually the second largest organism in the world. How can that be? It's a grove of trees, 106 acres of trees, but they all spring from one common ancestor. They are all connected through a root system that is one, they are a genetically identical single root system based organism that is estimated at being 80,000 years old. So just think about that. The biomass that is comprised of the quaking aspens that, or I should say the quaking aspen that spreads across 106 acres is over 13 million tons of biomass. We're talking an enormous organism. Now, I said it's the second largest in the world. You're probably wondering what the largest is. There are some enormous fungal mats in Oregon that cover a larger area, but they don't have the same kind of biomass that Pando has. But that said, you might be wondering what Pando means. It actually means I spread, which is a very appropriate name. And the group of trees that are found in the Fish Lake National Forest in central Utah are often referred to collectively as the trembling giant. So this is a really special place, and thank you, Margaret, for giving me the opportunity to learn a bit more about Pando. I've heard about it. I'm sorry about that. That was me. Now, you might think an organism that's been around as one organism growing bit by bit for 80,000 years would be healthy. Unfortunately, though, largely attributed to some of the issues associated with climate change, this organism is starting to show some problems. The roots are starting to be attacked by a disease and a rot that is exacerbated by climate change. There are insects that are starting to predate upon the individual trees within this one global colony. Regeneration has been difficult of new young trees within this colony because of overharvest by deer and other animals that have kind of grown out of control with the food source that's available for them. So there are some issues here. I still would say, I'd probably still put my money on an 80,000-year-old organism to continue on, but it is really showing some major signs of concern. But as you think about Pando and the connection between this one organism spreading across 106 acres, it made me think about the way that forests are connected to each other. And since our organization is all about connecting people to the land, I thought it would be good to talk a little bit about the wood wide web. And this picture looks a little fantastical with these energy impulses happening underneath the soil. But actually there are electrical impulses that trees use to talk to one another. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So this might be a little bit hard to see from where you are, but there is a huge network underground, again called the Wood Wide Web, called a mycorrhizal network. That is the way that trees can exchange resources with other trees throughout a forest, but it's basically a mutualistic relationship between fungi, not like I'm a fungi, but fungi in the forest, and trees and other plants. And underground, these fungi have created these amazing networks of mycelium, which are connected to roots. And through this vast network, trees are able to share carbon with other trees. They're able to share nitrogen, potassium, other nutrients, and they're also able to share signals through that electrical impulse that can alert other trees to harm. Now, it's not all to the mutual benefit of other trees. Trees can also do some nasty things to other trees. They can send out some chemicals that actually can impede the growth of competitors. So it's amazing what happens underground as part of this wood wide web. So if you looked at a cross-section of a forest, you would see something like the top picture there. You look at the dense network of mycelium that are that is that superhighway of connection that is bringing resources back and forth and helping trees communicate with those around them. In fact, it's so densely packed with mycelium that just 1 teaspoon of forest soil can include 3 miles of mycelium thread. 1 teaspoon, 3 miles of mycelium. So think about how dense that network is. And if you look at the picture on the bottom, imagine an aerial view of a forest and think about those larger green dots as the older trees, which have more connections with trees than the younger ones. You know, that is basically the underground network that you don't see, are all those connecting lines. And so a tree on the outer edge of that forest can communicate with trees all the way on the other side of the forest through this network and exchange resources. And I'll talk about a few things that trees can do in communicating with each other that are really pretty amazing. So upper left, you see a bunch of acorns. Have you ever noticed that when you're in a forest, there are some years where there seem to be a lot of acorns, and some years where there aren't that many acorns. And you may have also noticed that those acorns will usually be falling right around the same time across a long area. How does that happen? Well, that's part of the wood wide web. These trees actually have a strategy that has evolved for many thousands of years to every 2 to 5 years go through these cycles where they'll have a couple lean years with not many acorns, which is intended to basically starve out the predators who eat acorns. And then when their numbers are down, they come out with one of these bumper crops of acorns. So they absolutely overwhelm the ability of predators to eat the acorns, and that's how they're able to survive as a species. But the whole coordination of, is this a bumper crop year, or is this a low acorn year, and when, that's all communicated between trees as part of the wood wide web. That bear there was eating a salmon. This was kind of some interesting research that has been done on this. Bears like to catch salmon in British Columbia and take them into the woods to have their meal. And where they leave the fish carcass, it degrades into the soil. Well, they've measured trees in the proximity of where these bear carcasses or these salmon carcasses are being left, and they have found nitrogen from salmon in trees all around this area. So you have trees that are picking up this salmon nitrogen and then spreading it amongst other trees. So they talk about the wildlife to soil to tree cycle, and this is kind of a classic example of it. Another just amazing adaptation over time is trees have adapted to being nibbled on by deer so well that they know the difference between a deer nibbling on a leaf and a person coming by and cracking a branch with their hand. They're supposedly actually sensing the saliva of the deer, and when they sense the saliva, they will send tannins to that area of the tree, which make the leaves very bitter and unpalatable. But if someone were to just break a branch, as if they're trying to be a deer without the saliva, the tree would know this. They wouldn't send any tannins to that area. They would just send what needs to be sent to that area to help it heal. So these trees are incredibly sensitive that way, but they can also share that knowledge, we'll say, with surrounding trees as well. And then lastly, in a similar fashion, there are trees that have evolved around knowing when there are outbreaks of caterpillars that are eating leaves. They can send signals through the air to parasitic wasps that will come and lay eggs on the caterpillars, and then when the eggs hatch, these young parasitic wasps will actually eat the caterpillars. And this is all based on the signal that was sent into the air by the trees. It's amazing. In this instance, they're not communicating with other trees, they're communicating with parasitic wasps. So I guess I'm encouraging all of you, as you walk through a forest, to think about what's happening underground and to think about what's happening in the air around you. If you ever feel like when you're in a forest, it kind of feels different here, maybe there's a reason. Maybe it is a little bit different. Last example, and this is a classic one. I'm just going to grab a quick drink. So you may have heard about giraffes and acacia trees, which have, again, evolved together over many, many generations. Acacia trees, as you can see on the inset photo there, have these, amazingly long thorns that are their way of protecting themselves. But they can protect themselves even better than that. When they sense a giraffe is nibbling on their leaves, they can put into the air what's an ethylene gas, which actually has the result of changing the taste of the leaves so that they are not palatable. And they also, this gas is picked up by other acacia trees, and they start, before the giraffes even get there, changing the palatability of their leaves as a result. Now, giraffes have evolved with this tree behavior through time, so they have kind of caught wind of this, so to speak. And what the giraffes now do is they when they're approaching acacia trees, they come from downwind. So they know that if there's ethylene gas that is put into the air, it's not going to interrupt their next acacia trees that they're going to. They even have adapted such that if it's not a windy day at all and there is no wind, they will put at least 100 yards between where they feed on one group of acacia trees and the next. So you have this really amazing communication between trees and an understanding by those who are feeding them. So again, these amazing systems that we don't always appreciate. All right, how am I doing on time? I'm going to sum up pretty quickly here and just say, so taking this, doing a little pivot to, what if we could communicate with each other like trees communicate in a forest? And what if, as advocates for all sorts of good things in the world, we could join up our efforts? So here's my hopeful human tree of connections. Now, of course, at our organization, we're trying to protect parks and forests and trails and outdoor resources. So what if we could all pool our efforts somehow, like they do in a forest, to make a difference? And maybe there would be some trembling in the General Assembly. Who knows? I'm hoping that this might be one of the results, a little bit of trembling, if we could pool our resources. So I might just mention one last thing here, and then if there are questions, we can come back to any of this. Right now happens to be we're the last 2 weeks of the 2022 legislative session, which ends on May 4th at midnight. There are a lot of things that are happening right now, a lot of decisions that are being made on the budget, which if you care about state parks, this is a good time to be paying attention. I mentioned the Passport to the Parks being a really important program that we want to make sure stays intact. There have been proposals in the past, fortunately not yet this year, I hope not this year, to take some of the money that's generated through this fund and divert it away from parks to other priorities. Let's make sure that doesn't happen. We want to make sure it keeps on doing its part to keep parks well maintained and open to the public for free. There also has been a recent cut that was proposed in the legislature to state park infrastructure, meaning bathhouses, all of the public amenities to make buildings more accessible to the public. This would cut in half what is being, I'll try to not be too wonky with this. The governor proposed $55 million for state park infrastructure, which is great. This was proposed on Valentine's Day, big ceremony at Sherwood Island State Park. And the legislators said, we realize there's a $150 million backlog of necessary maintenance for the state parks. I think there are other things that we'd like to spend some money on. So they've proposed a cut to that, to the amount that the governor put forward of $12.5 million. We are hoping in the last couple of weeks of the session to reverse that cut. And if any of you know some legislators or would be willing to contact legislators about that, I would just encourage you, you can contact me. You can visit the website of the Connecticut Forest and Park Association. We'd love to have you get involved. So, all right, we've gone from starting down the path of poetry, the connection to poetry and the outdoors. We've gone to the connection between trees, and now it's the connection between all of you and your legislators. So let's hope that that's the next step, and there will be some trembling and burning. Thank you. Let's bring up the next.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I am going to, my goal in this discussion is to try to take us from the sort of freedom land and trees to the other 2/3 of the earth. And I'm following Eric's very terrestrially rooted talk because, like a watershed, it all flows to the sea. So everything ends up here. Let's see if I can do this. So before I start, I do want to make an acknowledgement. I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we learn, live, and are meeting tonight, and recognize their continuing connection to land, waters, and culture. And I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And I also want to give my thanks to Margaret Gibson for inviting me to be part of this very special Earth Day celebration, and to the creativity of all the poets who contributed to waking up the earth, because I've really enjoyed it. So thank you. And I wanted to just start with a little bit about me and a little background on how I came to be here, thinking about that confluence of science and poetry, and how this confluence may be critical to creating a sustainable path forward. I grew up in New York City in the 1960s and 70s on Staten Island in a little small crappy apartment with an amazing view of New York Harbor, because my mom said she could not live anywhere where she couldn't see the water. She's from Groton, Connecticut. And in this so-called garden apartment we lived in St. George, we faced the railroad tracks, and there was one tree in the front yard, and it was a lovely large mimosa that they cut down while I was in high school, so there were no trees, and 4 large patches of dirt where maybe there had once been a garden. And in the vacant lot behind our apartment, there was a tangle of vines and weedy ailanthus trees, which are also interestingly called the tree of heaven. because they were introduced from China, where maybe they were good, but in New York they're kind of noxious, weedy, and invasive. But that's what we had there. And I have to just say that Rhonda Ward's poem, Urban Aesthetic, really resonated with me. And I'm only going to give a little tidbit of it. But she writes, I ain't got no garden. All I got is this stretch of dirt in my shortcut. A few weeds peeking up in cross-eyed patches, looking like they want to be cabbage or greens. And growing up on Staten Island, I explored the irrepressible nature that grew along those railroad tracks, and I went behind the scary billboard on the road, behind into a tangle thicket where, like, you know, condoms and mattresses and bottles and butts were all lined up. And those weeds and thickets were my wilderness, and that was my wildness, and to tell you the truth, paraphrase someone that you probably all know, that was my salvation. And as Rhonda also writes, beauty ain't lost on ghetto folks, and I would add, neither is nature. It's, you know, it's there, it's biodiverse, it's cosmopolitan, and it's resilient. It's what is peeking up through those cracks in the sidewalk, right? And so I had to put that in because it really spoke to me. Anyway, I navigated away from the city to go to college with its own old growth forest, the Beinecke stand. I was psyched. And I got a degree in biology, and I went to graduate school in Alaska where I studied and fished and ate salmon and became a fisheries scientist. And then I went to the Pacific Northwest where I worked for Indian tribes, the Makah and the Squaxin Island tribe, and I worked as a fishery manager. And I went to a seasonal cycle of meetings all along the Pacific coast from California to Canada, and I realized I wasn't managing fish, I was managing people. And then, like a salmon returning to its natal stream, I returned to the East Coast, and I got my doctorate at Yale. And then I took a deep dive into the social sciences to study coastal marine resource management, basically how tribes co-manage the resource with the state from a different perspective. And now I've found myself recently poking my toes into a really different pool, the humanities, specifically the arts, broadly construed, visual, written, performed, digitized, emergent. I'm interested in exploring the impacts of incorporating the arts into science, education, into my teaching, and ultimately into enhancing stewardship values and conservation behaviors. Most recently, I've been working, here it is. Most recently, I've worked with Connecticut College professor Andrea Wolensack on her project entitled Reading the Racklines. We incorporated poetry and science into her art classes and into my environmental science and policy classes. We traded lectures, and then our students all wrote poetry, mostly haikus. And then, well, it's because they were short. This is Earth Day last year. At Avery Point, we projected, Andrea does this amazing kind of interactive videography where she, took those spoken words, because they all recorded them, and we had the visuals projected on our lighthouse, and that was what we did last April 2021. Kind of went back. Oops. That's there. Sorry. So anyway, over 10 years ago, I think my slides are out of order, I apologize. I developed at Connecticut Sea Grant, where I work now, at the University of Connecticut. In fact, I just want to say there's some magazines and really cool stickers on the table in the back. You should all grab them. And they are water resistant, so you can actually put them in your dishwasher, and you're supposed to put them on a reusable water container or drink container. And they are to prevent or decrease or to enhance awareness, let me say, of single-use plastic in the environment. But anyway, over 10 years ago, I developed at Sea Grant an art award program. We're now in, I think, our 12th or 13th year, and we've funded over 17 artists in that, again, widely. We have a deadline if you want to submit coming up. I think it's May 16th. That's the call right there. It's been a really good thing. And then 3 years ago, I was able to co-curate a big retrospective exhibit at our Alexi von Schlippe Gallery, which was really fabulous. So I've really been interested in the arts for quite a while. Now I'm going to go through this. And then this is also Andrea Wollensack's work. So she cut boiled wool with a 3D kind of laser cutter. And she cut the poetry into these three-dimensional piles. It was very cool. Very cool. So Margaret asked us to read poems in the volume, she's already said. And I was so interested to, think about how science could amplify the readings, and I do have some readings. I chose a few poems, not just one, but just something. But I'm also interested in how poetry and other creative outputs can contribute to our understanding of the natural world, the converse, and how they can combine to help us heal this damage, how science and poetry together can really take us forward and contribute to helping us understand and steward and heal our earth in this time of crisis. So that's where I'm going to go today, and that's really what I've been interested in. I should go back, but I won't. Arthur C. Clarke is reported to have said how inappropriate to call this planet Earth when clearly it is ocean. And seen from outer space on the... So unequal tomorrow. You're good. And there's that blue marble I was just talking about. And so this is true when seen from space, this iconic picture that NASA took that came out of the first spaceship, space flight rather, it looked just like a blue marble. They were like amazed and they snapped a snapshot of it. This is a satellite image, I think at this point, came from NASA's website. So, the ocean is really the defining feature of our Earth. It's true. And there we go. Rachel Carson, I think, is a terrific example of this creative impact of combining poetry and science. And I teach a course actually called The Sea Around Us, which is an intro marine science course. And I realized my students didn't really know who Rachel Carson was, so I spent time talking about her. But she wrote this really prescient type of, beautiful paragraphs in that book. The winds, the seas, and the moving tides are what they are, and if there's wonder and beauty and majesty in them, science will discover these qualities. And if they are not there, science cannot create them. If there's poetry in my book about the sea, it's not because I deliberately put it there, but because no one could write truthfully about the sea and leave out the poetry. And she really is an amazing human. She helped launch the modern environmental movement. She firmly placed humans in nature. She linked human health to the health of Earth systems. And she cautioned us that the real threat of our actions is life, including to our own species. And this little part down here is, which I can't read, let me see, is from the preface. So it says, it's a curious situation that the sea from which we first arose should now be threatened by the activities of one form of that life. But the sea, though changed in a sinister way, will continue to exist. The threat is rather to life itself. So The Sea Around Us was written in 1950, and that's a preface to a revised version of it that she wrote in 1960. So I think that's just really, something we keep in mind, because really the threats that, the earth, the ocean, that will continue. It is really to, our own species and those other species. So I kind of want to segue to the poem Rock Me Mama by Christy Max Williams, because it really attracted me with its evocation of horseshoe crabs, shorebirds, salmon, and sandhill cranes. And it reminded me of my time in Alaska and Washington when I was fishing and researching salmon. And I'm going to just... So he writes, rock me mama, in the lap of your tidal sway, your Ebbin surge, your procreant surge. Rock me a long Alaskan summer day when salmon schooling by millions, Chinook, coho, sockeye pink, surge from the sea where the years have grown them into mighty swimming muscles, flexing with fertility, surging to shore in search of natal waters, every brook, stream, and river, a salmon birthplace and destiny where they will spawn and die. So I thought this is interesting. You know, I consider the horseshoe crab, the salmon, the seabird to be integrator species. Basically, the fertility of these organisms provide fertility to the encompassing ecosystem. Ocean nutrients are captured by those salmon when they swim in the ocean, and it is transported to streams and rivers and this cycles. And these nutrients are released, and David stole a lot of my thunder, just saying, okay, sorry, are released when they spawn and die, feeding eagles and bears and other terrestrial species, and ultimately feeding that very forest that Laura told us about. And in her book, Finding the Mother Tree by Suzanne Simard, she presents data on those isotopes of nitrogen and other of the nutrients that are found there, and it directly links the salmon to the health of those Pacific coastal forests. So it's a very cool system. And the trees are linked together to fungal mycorrhizal networks, and they share nutrients and water and photosynthate, and altogether can promote the health of that system. And I also, wanted to just talk a moment about those horseshoe crabs that he mentions in there. This is an ancient species of, that exists on Earth. It's kind of an evolutionary dead end at this point. It's so old. And they lay eggs by the millions in the sands along the East Coast. We have them in Connecticut, but our population is declining because of coastal development. We don't have that many sandy beaches. And also harvesting for whelk bait right after the lobster fishery died. Our lobstermen, a lot of them turned to whelk, and so this ancient species apparently is good bait. And I wanted to just say, you probably can't see it, but that's a certificate that I got for finding a tagged horseshoe crab. In 2008, I found it at Jupiter Point in Groton. It had been tagged in Maryland in 2005. That horseshoe crab walked, through the Hudson Canyon from, Maryland all the way to Connecticut, to Long Island Sound. It had been tagged by a pharmaceutical company because they bleed them for their copper-containing blue blood, which is an amazing thing, more expensive per ounce than cocaine, I think. And I don't really know the cost of cocaine. Just saying. Anyway, I just love to envision this little horseshoe crab making its way up, no one really knew that they migrated. They're not really a migratory, they go in and out, but kind of cool. Anyway, these horseshoe crabs, they're declining here, but in Delaware they have large concentrations, and they provide eggs. Their eggs are critical food for those shorebirds that migrate, like the red knots and the plover and the sanderlings that Christy mentions in his poem. And these and other seabirds release their guano into coastal waters, and they fertilize long and productive food chains. These are integrator species. They cycle nutrients in a manner that connects land, sea, and air. And in this process, they promote the health of all the procreant surge of those ecosystems and the species that live in them. And these species and the relationships, though, are threatened by our changing climate, by droughts and that dewater the streams and prevent upstream passage, by heat waves that exceed the physiological thresholds of these species, and also deplete the oxygen in the water, and that shift the precise phenology, that timing, that wonderful synchronicity that Margaret talked about, that ensures that the right prey are available when they're needed, and that the trophic relationships are balanced. They're also threatened by the acidifying waters that are dissolving more than they are accreting. Christy writes, "A tender cooling, Mama. You are owed a tender cooling," and certainly that is true. And, I also really enjoy David Leff's poem, Climate Change Quartet, and he speaks of the change in geologic time scales through different perspectives. The glacial boulder, untold ages tattooed with lichens, gathered a company of grasses, ferns, and conifers, before the coming of birch, maple, and beech, whose snaking roots split me in two. I love this recounting of successional change. The transformation of habitats by species into systems that are no longer compatible with their needs, but now support other species, passing the baton forward. We watch as a glacial boulder is transformed by mere lichen, that oddly individual-looking organism that is really a multiplicity of species. David calls it seemingly plant-like. Our shrewd conspiracy of fungi and algae is the ineffable soul of problem-solving collaborations. I love that. To become soil, capable of supporting grasses, shrubs, and trees, transformed ultimately into a shifting mosaic that we call forest around here. As C.S. Hollings notes in his theory of the adaptive cycle of resilience, collapse and reorganization are necessary for regrowth and conservation to occur. And David's poem continues. Sorry, with the yellow birch. Rot is beautiful. Autumn leaves, fallen branches, and toppled trunks sustain us with humus, in turn nourishing humanity. I'll persist until my time's done, but winged seeds riding warming winds will find a cooler spot far north where our boulder was born. He depicts also the circular economy of nature here, but with a hermit thrush, he notes, timing is everything, and evermore chancing under shifting skies, exhaling southerly breath. And then he goes on, planetary clocks are out of kilter, the synchronicity of seasons just fly by night. So we see here that things are not as they should be, that anthropogenic climate change is causing shifts in community structure, successional changes and adaptations and the relationships that these species have developed over evolutionary timescales, take a lot of time to get there. They don't change in the mere century or so since combustion engines and fossil fuels emissions have arrived. And this is true of aquatic species. I'm going to get this back to the water. And they're moving north, our aquatic species, and their thermal habitats are changing. They're moving offshore to cooler waters. At some point they may run out of room in these cooler waters to the north, but northern species have no places to go. And we got to remember the lobster. The lobster crashed in 1999. It was death by 1,000 cuts. One of the main cuts was warming waters that depleted oxygen. We also had pesticides sprayed with the fear of West Nile fires. And we had opportunistic pathogens, and we had harvest pressure, all conspiring to basically drive this species to commercial extinction. But we also see, and I probably don't have time to go through, that we have, many species that are shifting north. There have been many studies by the National Marine Fisheries Service that show 39 species that are commercially valuable and moving into northern waters out of our range. Around Connecticut, we're getting black sea bass, we're getting skunk, summer flounder, more abundant. Things like winter flounder are less abundant. So these things are moving. These species may grow better in warmer waters, but they don't recruit and reproduce as well. It puts physiological stress on them. And so there are going to be consequences to both the natural food chain and the people who like to be part of that food chain. All right, so I wanted to just finish up by talking about Clara City's The Song of the Dusty Seaside Sparrow. And I'm going to read that part. All right, just a little snippet. How is it that the species that designs sparrowsides and sites freeways through meeting grounds, rather nesting grounds, also salvages, so that with a finger's pressure on an acquiescent key, I can make an extinct bird sing? And I didn't know anything about the dusky seaside sparrow. This poem compelled me to go research it, I've got to say, and what happened to it. This Floridian species was officially declared extinct in 1990. The last species, kind of ironically, was seen on Discovery Island in Disney World in 1987, and it was basically extirpated by marsh draining and development, pesticides and pollution, and agriculture and mosquito abatement, and whole another death by 1,000 cuts. And I was reminded of the plight of the salt marsh sparrow here in Connecticut, which is a species studied by Chris Elfin, a professor at UConn, who's also been funded by Connecticut Sea Grant. It's a species of special concern in Connecticut and now being considered for listing under the Endangered Species Act by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. It lives and nests in the coastal marshes, salt marshes of Connecticut, and it is threatened now with development and sea level rise caused by climate change, as well as invasive phragmites and pollutants that bioaccumulate and biomagnify within this small bird's body. Its populations are small and fragmented, and their numbers are declining. And we should not let it meet that same fate as that dusky seaside sparrow, its Floridian cousin. We need to take action. Science and poetry can work in concert to engage our head, our hearts, and finally, to enable our hands to take action. So, I think, I just want to, if I remember what I said, so poetry, I think, has the power to shape and sharpen our sight, as I heard in the last panel. It gives us words to communicate and broaden our understandings, to frame our relationship with nature, and it can create emotional connections to the plight of the natural world. It inspires and it creates empathy. Working to create real and positive environmental change requires that inspiration and motivation. And I tell my students, in fact, they don't know it yet, but we're going to do this next week in class. This is their last assignment, and we'll be on their final exam. I tell them there are many potential futures that are out there. We really need to envision the future that we want to live in, that will sustain us. And then we need to basically figure out how we get there. And then we need to make that happen. Okay, we need to all take action to make our visions a reality, or we're not going to have a livable earth or ocean in the future. So I just want to thank you. And,